Okay, the other half of Twilight Hunger of chapter, I can't remember, 16. Just give me a minute, I gotta figure out where I was. I kind of lost my place and moved my hand. Pack, I hate to leave Stormy, Lou, but according to what I've been able to find out. Oh, okay, never mind. I found out now. If he knows about the films, we're as likely to find him in Maine as anywhere else. She blinked twice, then stared at him. Does that mean you're going with me? Yep. Well, will they let you before the case is solved? Nope. I'll just have to be sneaky. Good thing I've got an expert to help me on that. He gave her a smile, lopsided and sad, but real. She thought about hugging the big lug, but Stormy's parents came walking up to her then, her crying softly, him holding her. Go on in, Max, Mr. Jones said. We cleared it with the doctor, and we both think hearing your voice will do her a world of good. He pointed her down the hall. 207. Okay, you two ought to get something to eat and maybe rest a bit. I know you want to be here, but you're going to need time off too. If you go getting sick, you won't be much help to Stormy after all. We'll be fine. Go on. Go see her now. She glanced at Lou. Go ahead, Maxie. Take your time. I'll be here waiting. Sending him a grateful nod, she went down the hall, searched for the door marked 207, and found it. There she was a moment, though, when she almost couldn't go in. She stood with her hand on the door, not pushing it open, and she wondered if some deluded part of her mind thought this wouldn't be real until she saw it with her own eyes. Or if she was just afraid Stormy would die while she was in there. Didn't matter, Stormy mattered, that was all. She swallowed her fear, pushed the door open, peered inside. It did not look like Stormy lying in that bed, and for the barest instant Max thought she had the wrong room, but then logic made her look more closely. Yes, she was more still and pale than she had ever been, and her eyebrow ring had been removed. Her short, bleached hair had vanished. It might be swathed by the skull cap of bandages she wore, or it might have been shaved. Max didn't know. But the elfin face and fine-boned features were Stormy's. There were leads going from her head to a monitor, from her chest to another, from her nostrils to an oxygen pumps, from her wrist to an IV bag, and from somewhere under the sheets to a bag at the foot of the bed, which she did not want to think about. The nurse smiled at Max. Well, Tempest, you have a visitor, isn't that nice? Call her Stormy, Max said firmly. Make sure you tell the other nurses, too. She wouldn't answer to Tempest even if she was fully awake. The nurse nodded, turning with her hands on her hips. And here I was thinking what a gorgeous name you had. I love Tempest. Then she shrugged. I suppose Stormy is nice, too, though. She was leaning in, adjusting the covers, and talking to Stormy as if she were wide awake and hearing every word. Max liked the nurse. She liked her attitude. She liked the caring in her eyes. I'm Maxine, she told the nurse as she came closer. And do you prefer a preferred nickname too? Mad Max, but don't spread it around. The nurse laughed, patting Stormy's shoulder. Did you hear that, Mad Max girl? I like your friends. Well, have a seat, Mad Max, and I'll give you two some private time. Max sat down and the nurse left. The constant beep of the monitors was dragging, steadily, almost hypnotic. Man, we're going to have to get them to turn off the sound on these contraptions, Stormy, you think? She went closer, clasped Stormy's hand. It's Max, honey. I'm here, and I know what happened, okay? I know it wasn't Lou. I don't want you to worry about that. No response. She lay there completely silent and still. I know you're in there, Storm. I know you can hear me. She spoke louder, more firmly. Everything's fine. Your parents are fine, and I'm fine. And the man who did this is going down. You understand? Still nothing, just monotonous beeps. You have to focus, hon. Focus every ounce of your energy on waking up. You hear me? That's all I want you thinking about. And you might as well know you aren't going to be getting a moment's peace until you do. I'm getting your favorite CDs, and someone's going to be in here talking your damn multi-pierced ears off until you wake up. No one's going to leave you alone. You got that? The beeping patterns changed, picked up speed a little. Max glanced around her at the machines, as if she would know a damn thing by looking at them. But something had agitated Stormy. What had she just said? No one's going to leave you alone? She licked her lips. Being alone worries you, does it? Again the pace picked up. No one will leave you alone. I'm going to have someone guarding your door, and someone else in here with you, 24/7. I promise you, you're safe. You're safe here, okay? She couldn't tell if she had eased Stormy's mind or not, but the beep slowly resumed their former pattern. Keep trying to wake up, hun. The nurse came back in, and Max told Max it was time to go. Max nodded. I've got to leave for a little bit, babe. But I'll promise you're not going to be left alone. I promise. She turned to the nurse. Can you stay with her until her mom gets back? Of course I'm staying. It's almost time for my program. She reached for the remote, flicked on the room's television, and pulled up a chair. I hope you like Passions, girl, 'cause I never miss it. She told Stormy she loves it, Max said. I'll see you later, Storm. Don't be scared, hun. I've got your back, okay? The nurse nodded in approval, and Max left the room. Back in the waiting room, she went to Lou, leaned against his chest, and hoped he wouldn't complain. He didn't. He hugged her instead. We need to get guards in her room, Lou. If he finds out she's alive, he might come back. He would have no reason to. What if she saw him? Hun, you saw him. You already know what he looks like, as well as his name. Being ID'd is not on his list of worries for some reason. Still, sighing, he nodded. I'll get right on it. She closed her eyes. We have time to get some breakfast. Yeah, I phoned in, told them we'd be coming in at noon to talk to IAD and give our statements. We have a couple of hours yet. He took her arm, and they walked to the elevators together. Okay, let me make sure of something before. I might read another chapter. Tempted. Let me see how long it is. We'll back up. I probably shouldn't. This is pretty freaking long. I'm afraid to. I'll try. Chapter 17. Morgan slept through most of the day again. It was afternoon when she woke, stretching her arms above her head and arching her back, feeling good. She opened her eyes, and everything that had happened the night before returned to her. She felt a delicious sensitivity at her throat, and flinging back the covers into her dressing table to examine it in the mirror. A purplish bruise and the marks of his teeth. No punctures. No, he hadn't tasted her blood, but he'd fed her his own. He could still taste them on her tongue. What did it mean? She wondered yet again. How did one become a vampire, if it were possible at all? Was she already changing? Was this vitality singing in her veins a part of it, or only a temporary side effect from drinking him? This sleeping through the day, waking only late in the afternoon, was this a sign that she was becoming as he was? She only knew she'd be getting steadily weaker until he had first come to her. Now she felt stronger as she had the last time. She thought the way she had been feeling she might well have been dead by now without his intervention, his blood. He was keeping her alive, but for how long she had to know. And she knew where to find answers, or hoped she did. Dante's journals. There were still one or two she hadn't read completely through. That was what she would do for the rest of the afternoon, she decided. Read, research. She had several hours before dark, and that was precisely how she would fill them. She stripped off the torn buttonless nightgown, pulled on her white satin robe, tied it, and moved down the stairs to the study, where she kept the journals locked away in a safe. But when she stood in the open study door, she saw the mess on the floor and realized she had other work left to do. Broken boards lay beside the hole. If it were true that the scarred man was hunting Dante, and that if he were to come back here and somehow see this, darn. Her afternoon passed more quickly than she would have liked. She had to shower, dress, then taking one broken piece of wood with her, she drove to the town of the nearest lumber yard and purchased matching pieces of the correct length to patch the damage she had done. She bought a hammer and nails and a small crowbar and handsaw. When she returned home with her purchases and faced the task before her, she felt a hint of doubt that she would be able to pull it off. Ordinarily, this kind of physical labor would be far too much for her to tackle alone. She toyed with the idea of hiring someone to do the job, but realized she had no idea who she could trust. How would she explain the need to keep it quiet? And even if she did, wouldn't that just make the worker more likely to tell? Her being who she was, he would probably sell the tidbit to a scandal sheet. For a few $1,000s. Besides, she didn't feel as if the job was too much for her. Not today. Shrugging, she knelt on the floor, took up the crowbar. She would never know until she tried, she decided. It took her an hour to pull out the old nails that held the broken scraps of lumber to the main beams underneath and remove the bits of wood. Then more time as she measured the holes, marked her new boards at the right length. Now the test, she thought, as she took up the saw. As if she could manage this, it would be a miracle. Swallowing her doubts, she laid the saw blade across the line she'd drawn and drew it backwards. Then she began to pump the saw back and forth as smoothly as she could. The short end fell away, clattering to the floor, and she looked at it in something like shock. She drew a hand over her brow, felt sweat there. Her heart was pounding, her body warm with exertion. God, when was the last time she had felt like this way? She continued to work, sawing the boards, fitting them in place, nailing them as she went along. When there was only one board to go, she paused to kick up all the scraps and towed the old lumber, the broken pieces, the sawdust, the bent used nails into the hole. Then she nailed the final boards into place. It didn't look perfect when she finished. The boards were a different color, lighter, newer looking, unfinished, and the joints were less than right, but it was the best she could do at the moment. Her newfound energy seemed to be starting to wane. She got a broom to sweep up the remaining bits of sawdust and dirt. Then she pulled the oriental rug back down to cover the new boards, brushing her hands and straightening when she finished. Only an hour now until sundown. She looked down at herself, realized she was damp with sweat and had sawdust clinging to her skin and her hair. If he came back, God, she hoped he would. She didn't want him seeing her like this. I need to get ready, she whispered, for Dante. Yet more of the day wasted from her hands. She would barely have time to rest at all. Still, it was important. A half hour later, she returned to the study, freshly showered, her hair clean and lavender-scented and blown dry, flowing loose down her back. She wore the white satin robe that tied at the waist and hung all the way to her bare feet, and she carried a pot of herbal tea and a cup with her. It was a special blend, supposedly good for boosting one's energy. Hers was running low, though, still higher than it had been before Dante had come to her. She turned on the gas fireplace, then went to the safe in the wall, took out one of the precious journals, one of those she still hadn't read all the way through, and curled up in the big armchair nearest the fire. Filling her teacup, she flipped through the pages until she found the place where she had last left off, and before very long she was immersed once again in the tales of the vampire, hearing them as clearly in her mind as if they were spoken in Dante's deep, rich voice. Seraphina tried to warn me, never mix with mortals, never. She said it early in my education and repeated it often. Our kind must live alone. What about the chosen? I knew the term. That surprised her to some extent, I think because I hadn't heard it from her. We sat by a fire that night in a grove of trees. the way we had done in our mortal lives. I think that, at the beginning, that was what Seraphina envisioned, a band of two gypsy vampires, living the way we had before. She was trying, I think, to recapture some of what she had lost when she had lost her family, her tribe, but of course it was impossible. I accepted that long before she did. The chosen are humans with a connection to us. Something about the blood, she told me. We know which ones they are because we sense them. We feel drawn to them, and sometimes they to us. But we do not make ourselves known to them, Dante. That must be understood at all costs. We do not. They can become vampires like us, I said. They can and do, you know. What happens when they do? I shook my head. They go mad. She said it so simply, as if it were an established fact. All of them. I asked, even though I knew better. I hadn't gone mad, nor had Seraphina. She didn't answer that. Some become so morose they refuse to feed until their bodies become dormant. Brittle shells that lie as if dead for untold centuries, or their souls trapped inside. Some become giddy with their newfound vampiric powers and go on a gluttonous killing spree, leaving so many bodies in their wake that the mortals realize what is happening and hunt us like animals in their vengeance. They die too. We kill them ourselves. We have no choice unless the mortals beat us to it. I sat there listening, rapt with attention. Some simply opened a vein and let themselves bleed to death. Others walked deliberately into a fire like this one and burned to ash. I studied her for a long moment, the way the fire danced on her face and into her eyes. I was one of the chosen, I said. You sensed it on me and transformed me. I had no choice. You were dying. You had a choice. You could have let me die. She averted her eyes, shrugged as if my words were a little inconsequence. I think you planned to transform me all along, Seraphina. I think that's why you came back to the family, singled me out. She looked at me again, pierced me with her eyes. Perhaps I wished for that, Dante, but I would not have done it without careful consideration. This life is not an easy one. I know it must seem so to you at this point, but it's not. You think this life seems easy to me? I lost everyone. I loved Seraphina, my own mother, my family, my very way of life. Everything I knew was torn from me that night. It's been far from easy. Yet I have not gone mad or ended my own life. It will become harder. I mulled that over for a moment. How certain she sounded. Was she so unhappy then? I began to realize how very lonely she must have been all those years before I had crossed over to join her in darkness. Most mortals cannot bear the shock of the change, the loss of all they were. Even those who do not adjust and accept do not all last. 100 years perhaps too, and then the reality of eternal life begins to reveal itself to them as it really is, as much a curse as blessing, as much pain as pleasure, and they too often choose not to continue. And what of those who do? She was silent for a moment longer. Those who do continue, I suppose, find a way to make peace with what they are. They stop fighting it. They stop hoping for a cure to make them mortal again. They stop looking for rhyme or reason to explain their existence or justify it, and they simply accept. Have you reached that point? I asked her. Meeting my eye, she shook her head. No, but I have seen that acceptance in the eyes of some of the old ones. I have heard them speak of it, and I am determined to survive on my own terms and in my own way until I find it for myself. And she would, I thought, but for now she was restless, seeking something, maybe this peace she spoke of, maybe something else, I don't know. Then what do you do, Fina? I asked for companionship. We have each other for that. That's not the kind I meant. I had to look away, still not comfortable with the lustre aspects of what I was, still not understanding it, as this was very early in my preternatural life. I couldn't face her as I spoke. When I feed from the humans, especially the women, though, sometimes with the men as well, I feel desire, she said, finishing the sentence for me. I see now what it is you need to know, how to state it. Eyes fixed on the fire, I nodded. Do not be embarrassed, Dante. We are sensual creatures. It is our nature. Every physical sensation is heightened to degrees far too intense for mere mortals to bear. We feel everything 1,000 times more keenly than we did before. Pain, yes, to the point where it can paralyze us. But pleasure, too. God, the way we experience physical release is beyond comprehension. My throat went dry, and I felt a stirring of desire at her description. The bloodlust and sexual lust are very closely bound in our kind, she went on. You cannot experience one without the other. Should you attempt to have sex with a mortal, you will end up biting deeply into her flesh before you finished, drinking her until the two go hand in hand. The ecstasy of the drinking enhances the orgasm, and the orgasm enhances the ecstasy of the blood. The combination of the two is such potent, mind-numbing pleasure that you give yourself over completely to sensation. You hurt them, you kill them. I stared at her eyes through narrowed eyes. I don't think I believe that. No, certainly. I sense that some of what you are saying is true, but not the physical pleasure could drive me beyond the ability to control myself. Certainly not that. Perhaps, she said slowly, drawing out the word, it's less likely you'd kill one of the chosen, though still at risk. It's best to stick with other vampires or make yourself a few slaves. Slaves, I said, the word with contempt. She always kept several at her disposal, mortals, not of the chosen caste, whom she had made virtual zombies, utterly devoted to her. She drained them, but not to the point of death, then replenished their bodies with a modicum of her own cursed blood. She did this over and over, keeping them captive for days at a time, until the bond was forged. One night she would rise to find them utterly hers, ready to obey her every command, their very existence based on their desire to please her. I did not know how she managed to mate with these mindless drones without killing them. I think she usually did end up killing them in the end, but how she kept them alive in the meantime I do not know. I hated them. I hated the sight of them, and I had no desire to know the details of what she did with them. But for me, I knew my own soul, and I knew that I could never become so drunk on pleasure that I would kill an innocent. I don't believe you, I told her. I think you only want to keep me from being close to anyone other than you. She lifted her brows. Do you now? Yes, perhaps you don't have the inner strength to control your lust to have sex without murdering your partner, but I do. That's very good to know. I was not to know it then, but my dear benefactor had a plan in mind to teach me once and for all the truth. It was weeks later. We were staying in a fine home, guests of some wealthy old man who was utterly smitten with Seraphina. I disliked mixing with the mortals this way, living among them, making excuses for the hours I kept. This did not bother Seraphina. She didn't mind living with them. She kept herself hidden away behind a patina of lies. No part of her body or soul ever touched them. Not on any level beyond that of predator and prey. She was playing make-believe as their friends, their guests. She felt nothing for them, nothing. And I was fairly certain she had been hunting peasants in the nearby village. 3 people had gone missing since our arrival. I did not like to think that my aunt was murdering the innocent. However, it was her choice, not mine. We did not sit in judgment of the acts of another vampire unless they directly endangered us as a whole. So long as she was careful to dispose of the bodies and didn't kill too many in one town and draw suspicion on herself, I had no business telling her it was wrong, much less trying to stop her. She would have to deal with her own guilt or karma or sin or whatever were the results of her actions. It was not my place. This was one rule among her kind, and the first my aunt ever had taught me. It was as I contemplated these things in my rooms one night that a gentle tap sounded on my door. I didn't bother opening my mind to gather impressions, a mistake I made often. I fear in my early days I simply assumed it was Fina and called her enter. The door opened, and the serving maid I remembered from the late dinners were Fina, and I pretended to eat with our host and various guests night after tiresome night. Stepped inside. She wore very little, a nightgown of fabric so sheer that every inch of her warm mortal flesh was visible, and she carried a candle. Her hair... Give me a minute. Masses of it, honey blonde and wild, curling, was loose and tumbling, her lips wet and parted, her body full of and lush. Forcing my gaze to her face, her eyes, I said, "What is it you want of me?" "You got it wrong, my lord. I've come to ask that very question of you." Her accent was of the lower classes, though not quite Cockney. She trained herself to lose the harshness edges of her natural speech, I guessed, imitating instead the more pleasing tones of her employers. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." She stepped further inside, setting her candlestick on the bureau, closing the large door behind her, and then eyeing me calmly. "I see the way you look at me, my lord. Am I breast when I lean close to pour your tea? And am I arse when I bend to pour..." I hope I said that right. I'm not good at reading that. "When I bend to pour anyone else's? I got tired of waiting for you to ask. Thought I might be bold and make the offer." It was true enough. The wench wore necklines scooped so low I had wondered more than once how she kept those delightfully plump breasts contained. They swelled above the fabric of her dresses, and she made sure to wave them under my nose as often as possible. I had been intrigued. "Surely you're not shy now, are you, my lord?" "No, I'm not shy. You'll find I'm not either," and she proved it while walking across the room toward me, tugging at a tie at her neck line and shuckling even the thin garment she'd been wearing. It floated to the floor, and she stood proudly naked, not a foot from where I still sat in a chair near the fireplace. I could smell her every scent. She was clean, freshly bathed, just for me, I thought. Her hair smelled of henna, her skin of aloe, and I smelled her arousal too, and knew she was damp with the juices of it, and I'd yet to even touch her. I licked my lips in anticipation. God knew it had been years since I had known a woman in the way she wanted me to know her. I devoured many, yes, drinking from them in small, strained draughts that left me craving more and left them quivering with desire. I went to them by night, commanded them to remember me as a dream. Seraphina had told me I could do no more without killing them. I didn't believe her. Surely I could touch. The wench dropped to her knees, stroked her hand over my groin, and felt my arousal state. She smiled up at me, then tore my breeches open and bent to lick at my root. I shuddered in pleasure, desire blazing through me at the first touch of her tongue. But then she took me into her mouth, warm and wet. Now I've lost my place again. Took me deep, her arms twisted around behind me to hold me to her, and she bounced up and down on my sucking with all her might, even as the semen rose from my rod, so the bloodlust rose in my veins. I felt it, like a dark hunger, growing stronger with the pleasure she gave, till I could hear the blood rushing beneath her skin. I could smell it. I had to have it. Gripping a handful of her hair, I pulled her head from me, pulling her into her feet and forward so she straddled me, grabbed her hips and slammed her down, stabbing deeply into her, so deeply she cried out in pain or pleasure, or something mingled of the two. I don't know, didn't care. Again she began bouncing up and down on me. I had her throat in mind, her sweet jugular, but the swollen mounds of those succulent breasts bouncing in my face changed my mind. I reached out and caught one like a prize, sucked harder on the nipple, and then bent down. She shrieked in delight, and I pierced the very tip with an incisor and sucked hard at the thin trickle of blood that came. It touched my tongue, and I was lost. Sensation, need, that powerful hunger that overwhelms all logic, burned through my brain, and as I sucked harder, bit deeper to increase the blood flow, ignoring her shrieks as I held her to me and took what I wanted. even then, knowing it wasn't enough. I got up, my cock still embedded in her legs anchored around me, her bleeding nipple tightened my teeth, and I walked to the bed, tumbled us both down into it crossways, landing hard atop her. I let her breast go, at least as I ran myself into her, so powerfully the heavy bed thumped and jerked. Inching across the floor with my thrust, she was crying out now, too loudly not to be heard. In her passion, I silenced the wench with a hand to her mouth and sank my teeth into the other breast, biting her deeper this time, plunging both fangs into the hilt and drink sucking. Some words I don't like saying. Screwed her hard and sank my teeth into her delicious flesh over and over again. My shoulder, her arms, and finally her throat. My razor-sharp teeth sank through her flesh as if it were butter, broke through the cartilage with a popping sound, and then the juggler gave up its bounty. I drove my shaft to the hilt as her heart pumped the blood into me in willing sacrifice. I devoured her and climaxed. It was magnified 1,000 times from the climax I'd known as a mortal. 1,000,000 times. My body nearly shook itself apart. I was momentarily blind, deaf. My entire body being was focused at the two places where we were joined. My cock inside her and my teeth in her throat. But between the two arched bolts of lightning, and that was all I was. Sheer mind-bending pleasure, so intense it was agony. I cried out with it, releasing her throat, drawing my head back to roar in savage delight. When the sensations finally waned, I still lay there on top her, relishing the relief of her life thrumming in my veins and the satisfaction of sexual release. I was high, soaring on the aftermath of such an intense gratification. I was warm, her blood pumping through me empowered me. Gradually, I became aware of a slow rhythmic clapping from somewhere in the room. Blinking out of the buzzing energy in my head, I lifted my eyes, focused in, and saw Seraphina standing on the far side of the room, plotting. Well done, Dante. Very well done. I looked down at the woman beneath me. Her eyes were wide open and glazing already, and her throat, God, I hadn't simply punctured it. I'd torn a wide gaping wound. I'd ripped her flesh, severed the vein, torn through the muscle, bearing her windpipe. I scrambled off her, backed away, but I saw it all. There were smaller wounds on her breast, her arms, her shoulder, even her jaw. They'd bled, but only little. I hadn't let much of that nectar escape my hungry mouth. Her center was torn, bloody from the force with which I plummeted her. I brought a hand to my mouth in shock, but it came away with traces of scarlet adorning it. It was on my face, I knew. I buried my face in that wound, savoring to get more of her into me. And I must be wearing a lot of the evidence still. It was on my hands, my chest. Turning in shock to Seraphina, I whispered, "Why didn't you stop me? Why?" "Stop you?" She shook her head. "I sent her to you, Dante. Some lessons are only learned by doing. Now you know what will happen if you spend your passion on a mortal. Save it. Slaves or other vampires are the only safe options if you are determined not to kill. Then again, perhaps you changed your mind about that. Now you know. Now that you've seen how good it is, I don't kill. You do now, like a wolf or a shark or any other predator. You had a taste of it, Dante. You'll do it again. We're predators. It's what we do. But that argument is for later. Now we must leave this place before tonight work is discovered. Wrap the slut in blankets and go wash yourself up. I'll gather our things, but nothing. She's already composed a note informing the household that she has run away with a stable boy. I actually had her believing you would want to take her with us once you've sampled her luscious body." She tipped her head back, laughing delicately. "I vow, Dante, you did her nicely. I had no idea you were such a stallion." "Shut up, Fina." I saw where her eyes were and righted my breeches. "You're my aunt, for God's sake." "God has nothing to do with it, boy, and I'm not only your aunt, your great-great-aunt. I'm also your mother and your sire and your sister. The blood ties of the past mean nothing. We are of a new kind of family now, and I could take what you gave her to her and more without sustaining any damage at all. I stared at her coldly. The blood ties of the past still mean something to me, Seraphina, and I promise you we will never be together in that way. I saw the hurt and the anger in her eyes. Perhaps she had been undead for so long that the property of mortals meant nothing to her. Perhaps she had forgotten it, but I hadn't. I hurt her with those words, but I meant them. And while I hated what she had done to me that night, I knew that I had to learned an important lesson, never to have physical relations with a mortal. Morgan closed the book, blinking in shock. There had been expectation, something about slaves, which she didn't find the least appealing, something about the chosen, which she understood even less, and other vampires. Nothing about how one made other vampires. Nothing about anything helpful except that she now knew why Dante refused to sleep with her. And she thought it might be for the best. She certainly didn't want him to kill her. She glanced down at her attire, licking her lips in trepidation. Quickly she jumped to her feet, returned the journal to its safe, closed and locked the door, and then closed the false bookcase over it. She ran out of the study, hurrying up the stairs to her bedroom, slammed the door behind her. She had to change. She didn't want to tempt him to do that to her. Sorry, I'm just trying to get comfortable. But the moment she closed her bedroom door, she heard him, not aloud, but in some strange, fascinating way inside her mind. Morgan. She ignored the voice in her head and tugged open a bureau. Morgan. The French door flew open, blasted by a gust of wind. She spun around, gasping in shock, but he wasn't standing there in the balcony as if she had expected. Trembling, she went to the doors and pulled them closed. That was when she saw him. He stood on the back lawn, halfway between the house and the sea. She felt him looking right at her. Come out to hear me now. Could she really be hearing him without a sound? She thought about calling down that she would just be a minute, but the final word came again, now. It compelled her. She couldn't convince herself not to obey. Turning, Morgan walked out of her bedroom, down the stairs, and through the house to the back door. She stepped out into the flagstone patio and down 3 more steps until her bare feet were sinking in to the damp, cold grass. It sent a chill through her, and still she walked on. She walked until she stood facing him at arm's length between his body and hers. His gaze slid down her body. She felt it touch like a shivered with the cold and with awareness. Now we have time, all night in fact. And you're going to tell me, Morgan, how you know about me. She met his eyes and found herself incapable of coherent thought. There was nothing in her mind beyond submission, obedience. It took her an act of sheer will to break the hold of those eyes on her, compelling her to tell him everything. He wanted to know, but she did it. She looked away, past him at the sea. Her mind whispered that if she told him about the journals, he would take them away, and God, she couldn't lose her only link to him. Or were they her only link to him? How did you do that? She whispered. His eyes closed for a minute as he sought patience. Summon you here? He asked, and when she nodded, he sighed. I'm a vampire, an old one. It wasn't an answer. So you've learned mind control over the years? To some extent, yes. Then you could summon anyone to come to you, make them come even if they didn't want to. She was looking at the ground now, anywhere but into his eyes. A finger hooked beneath her chin, tipped her head slowly up. You wanted to. A shiver worked through her body. It's more difficult to convince someone to do something they don't want to do. But I have the feeling, Morgan, that I can convince you to do just about anything I asked. Okay. Man, this is the first time I ever made 3 videos in one day. So yeah, I'm going to finish this chapter and then I'm going to stop. Okay, bye. No. I didn't mean to do that. I clicked the wrong button.